This is going to be a follow-up session, a little bit to our session 2 weeks ago about Intro to Entertainment Networking. We had a lot of questions about how to apply these concepts to a multi-console session in EOS specifically, so we're going to go through a lot of that this morning. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rob Crane. I'm a field project coordinator for ETC out of our Southwest region. And I'm going to kick it off here and then turn it over to Mr. Nick Gonzelman, who's going to give our presentation this morning. So just a couple quick things. Most of you have probably been in our study hall sessions before, so we'll make this real quick. If you haven't been to our study hall site, there's the web address right there. You can also get to it through your MyETC account. We're doing a little bit focused each day. So Tuesdays, we're focused on end users. Thursdays, like today, we're doing an EOS session, and then every Thursday we'll also do a HOG session right after this one. And then on Wednesdays and Fridays, we have sessions specifically geared for our dealers and reps and our certified technicians. So if you fall into those categories, you'll be able to have access to those through your MyETC account as well. If you haven't checked this out on Instagram, we are doing open office hours. So check over there for that schedule. We've also got our video of the day. So every day we post a video from our archives. It's pretty fun to see some of those come out, covering a range of topics. So that's also on the study hall page. And something a lot of you have taken advantage of is our learning stage classes. So we have those on our learning stage platform, and we have console classes, we have DMX and color classes, and we've had a lot of you sign up for those over the last, say, 6 weeks. So thanks for that. Keep up the good work. And if you haven't checked it out yet, feel free to do so. We also have classes around the world. So if you are not in North America, feel free to check in with your local ETC office and see what they are offering. And one change this week, so we have been archiving all of our webinars, such as this one. So if you've missed any of them, like the networking one from a couple weeks ago, you are able to watch those after the fact. And we do have a new YouTube channel, which is hosting all those. That's ETC Study Hall on YouTube. So those are all in one place, and you can go through and watch those at your leisure. And then just a couple other things coming up later on today for our HOG session is pigs, pallets, and punting. So that'll be a good one over with the HOG folks. And then next Thursday in this time slot, we'll be looking at Eos Family color controls. So if there are any questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A box in your over on your panel there, whichever side of it it's on for you. We do ask that you keep your question to one. Only hit send once. It helps us keep organized and make sure that we get to everybody's question, rather than asking part of a question and then a secondary question. So if you're able to do that, we'd really appreciate it. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Most of the time we are able to, but we'll see where we are on time constraints. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our field project coordinator from New York City, or one of them from New York City, Mr. Nick Gonzelman. Take it away, Nick.
Well, thanks, Rob. Good morning from New York. It's still barely morning here. You'll still see me still working on my coffee. So good to see so many people from all over the world. I hope everybody's staying safe and staying active. So this morning, today, we're going to be discussing multi-console systems and some programming for EOS Family consoles. I put this together mainly as a review of some of the bigger functions. You know, if you've been in some of our other sessions before, the programming side of things is often very nuanced. Everybody kind of has their own way of doing it. So we have some tools that we'll talk about. We'll have some general things that we'll go over so far as specific features that the desk offers. But I really am going to want to leave a little bit of time for questions today, so that if you have specific things, that we can try and answer some of those. So we'll go through some of the basics first, and then I hope to be able to answer whatever things y'all want to know. So first of all, what are multi-console systems? It sounds a little obvious. They are multiple consoles talking to one another. And the big thing is that they're sharing a show file and all of their data in real time, and they have a unified output to the rig. Each individual device isn't doing its own thing. They're a collection of devices that are communicating with one another and have a unified output and a unified presence. So that's a really important thing with multi-console systems. One of the things we often talk about is why do we deploy multi-console systems? One of the first and most important things is using a real-time full tracking backup, right? Consoles and dedicated hardware, as good as they are, they're computers at the end of the day. And so there's the possibility for failure, either from external circumstances or internal components. So while that's rare, we don't ever want to lose a show if we can help it. So you can put together multiple devices, and we'll talk about how backup scenarios work in a little bit more. We're also using multi-console systems for remote video throughout the space more and more as our production needs change and there's more integration between different departments. More departments want a view into what we're doing. So we deploy multi-console for the lighting team, obviously. The designer wants a view of the cue list and the channels. The associate and the assistant are doing tracking or things in the background. You may have the electrician at a dimmer bank with some access to the system. But now also automation wants a view of our cue list. Stage management wants to know where the lighting system is. So we're getting more and more requests from other departments to sort of get a status of where the lighting system is at. And then we also have the ability to do multiple programmers, right? So in situations where time is tight, you can deploy multiple programmers in the same system and have them work simultaneously either on the same thing or different things. And that can help speed up the process. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about partitions in particular. And then, the ability to remotely control and access things, right? We do have some situations where either across a venue or across, broad networks, corporate networks, things like that. TV studios are a really good example of this, where we're seeing one device controlling another device that's further away in a remote studio or something. So those are some of the examples of why we deploy multi-console systems. Really quickly, just what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about some of the physical connections of the systems. We're going to go through the session configuration, right, and a little bit of health and failure stuff. And then doing some basic show file setup for multiple programmers to give you some ideas if you're looking to get into a multi-programmer environment, what are some of the ways that you can do that? So really quickly, I just want to go through a networking review because this is the foundation of multi-console, right? All of your devices need to be able to talk to one another. So just a quick review of some of the things. If you were in our session 2 weeks ago, remember we like star topologies for our networks. So this is a graphic that was actually directly lifted from that PowerPoint. So this is kind of the network layout that we like. And that translates in actual devices to a network that may look like this, right? This includes maybe some power control racks, right? Dimmer or relay racks, some gateways that go out, some Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi connected devices, but also consoles, remote video stations, client computers, things like that, right? So this is kind of a more graphical sense of how we do with this stuff. A quick reminder of addressing when you're using IPv4, which is what all Eos family consoles use. You have 3 parts of your IP address. Don't forget that generally what we care about is making sure that all of the things that are in gray are the same device to device, and we're changing the device ID, the .90, .201, to make sure that all the devices can communicate and not have IP conflicts. So those are things that we care about. And then some other things to consider for your system, again, just basic networking configuration. Do you have a DHCP service? Do you need a DHCP service? Make sure that that's configured properly. Are you using NTP or SNTP time services? Is there only one time server, right? Sometimes we get calls that the clock keeps changing even though I've changed it in the shell, and that's because it's taking updates from incorrect time service online. So review these things, make sure that your network is configured, and that will give you the best success. I think a large thing that a lot of people run into is that their network just isn't functioning properly, and so multi-console doesn't work. So we need to get that settled first, then we can move in to actual multi-console programming. So everybody's talking, right? The network's good. My super funky Sam said earlier, it's my Zach Morris 80s cell phone graphic. So we're good. So the network's set, and we can start to bring devices online together. There's a few things that are in the shell that I want to go over first that have to do with getting the systems talking, right? And the first is your device name. So in your shell settings, your device name is the name that's going to show up to other devices on the network. So if you call your device booth Eos or whatever, that's going to be what shows up. If you call it RVI number 3, those are the things that show up. So having something that's a bit more useful to describe maybe what that hardware is or does, or if it belongs to a particular space, can help you when you're configuring your networks. The other thing that's in your general area is open shell in ECU, or EOS configuration utility. The shell is a useful place to decide which role you're going to pick. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but know that this is in the shell and that it affects how devices automatically come on and offline. So that's something to keep track of. And then when you're looking in your network tab, make sure that your network port is online, right? If this says offline and it's red, then you have a problem with your network connection. So again, we want to make sure that our status is online, that our IPs and everything match. We want to give ourselves a good kick for success. There's also a checkbox here, and this is on a per network port basis, and it's a checkbox that says required. And basically, sometimes the software on boot up, the Eos Family software, will launch before the switch and the network port on the physical console can communicate. And if that happens, then the software doesn't see the network connection and it's not online. So we have this checkbox in your console area that allows you to say, I'm going to wait to launch the EOS software until I've confirmed a network connection, right? So if you have trouble with that, where maybe your network connection is slow to handshake as you're booting up your console, checking this could be really, really useful, right? There's some other options in your console area of your network shell. Remote startup and shutdown. This allows you to basically call a command from any device on the network to say, hey, we're going to call a remote startup. And every device that has remote startup enabled will wake up, and same with shutdown. We can shut down a whole system from a single point in the network. There's some caveats to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about general session stuff. But out here in the networking area is where these are enabled or disabled. And then there's a nice little ping tool if you are trying to find other devices, if you're not sure if you have a good network connection, pinging another IP address can help you do that. Okay. Some other things that are useful in the shell, don't forget about your output protocols, right? And when we talk about who's actually outputting to the rig in a little bit, you want to make sure that your primary and your backup are outputting all the protocols that you are going to be using in your system, and that the settings match your system. We talked a little bit about ArtNet 2 weeks ago. You need to make sure that those settings will match whatever your receiving devices are expecting to hear. So there's a little bit of coordination to make sure that that's all set up properly. So be aware of that. You also have a couple checkboxes, and these will matter a lot more in a second when we talk about failover, but they're here in your networking area, which is backup takes over at a higher priority, and backup automatically takes control. There are two little checkboxes that really, really matter when you are in a failover situation. So making sure these are set up properly is really important. And then finally, just making sure your allowed output addresses are configured properly. Most people don't deal with adjusting the allowed output addresses, but there are some special circumstances, or it's a place to check if you've gotten a console from a rental facility. I like to go in here and just make sure that this is set to the maximum, which is your 64,999 universes for ACN. Also in your networking area, in interface protocols, multi-console has to be enabled. If this checkbox isn't enabled, you will not be able to get into a multi-console session. Again, this is on by default. There are some very specific situations where you may not want it on. And if there are questions about that, we can talk about that later on in Q&A. But make sure that that's checked if you expect to connect any devices. Again, rental situations, other people who have gone in and don't really know what these settings do. This is one of the first places to troubleshoot to make sure that your console can connect to other consoles. There's also the standard network dropdown, right? So this allows you to choose between what's called a standard network and an engineered network. The differences here are the latency in which a system initiates a failover scenario. So if the primary and the backup can't communicate, a standard network will give it a little bit more time and wiggle room before it says, I've failed, right? An engineered network, you're telling the system that this network is a lot faster, wider open, and so you get a tighter timeline that it will initiate a failover. Engineered networks are generally ones that are completely, you need a lot of specialty to get in and engineer the network. So by default, we come out of the box with a standard network. If you're not seeing any issues, then leave it as standard network. But if you want a tighter time, you can do a standard network. The next setting we have with multi-console is standard file transfer, fast file transfer. This has to do with how fast we're pushing show files over the network. And that really has to do, if you were in the networking presentation 2 weeks ago, with how much information we flood the pipe with. As you're saving show files, as you're transferring show files between devices, if we're doing a fast file transfer, we're just going to get it there as quickly as we can. And you may see some lags if you've got effects running or live moves happening or changes happening in your rig, because the ACN will be delayed getting to the gateways. If you have a standard file transfer, we're going to slow that down a bit. It'll take a couple more seconds for the file to transfer to the devices, but that has a lesser impact on output. So if you're on something like a live to air show, maybe normal file transfer is good for you. If you're in a theater situation where you're not really saving files in the middle of a performance, you're only saving files in the middle of tech and you don't care if stuff kind of hangs for a second, then fast file transfer could be useful. But that's what those settings do for you. The other thing in here is making sure that if you expect to use Wi-Fi remotes, that your primary and your backup have the ability to listen to Wi-Fi remotes, right? Again, if this checkbox isn't on, Wi-Fi remotes can't connect. And when we talk about the roles of devices, you'll see that we have you know, everything kind of routes through the primary in a healthy system. So definitely make sure that box is checked if you intend on using Wi-Fi remotes. Cool. Really quickly, does any questions come in from regarding the show? Not Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle related.
Just one question, just a clarification about networking stuff that I think, since we don't have a lot else, I think we can just quickly address. Why do we always assign a gateway and IP of 10.101.1.1 when there's no physical device with that address?
Yeah, so the gateway or the router, we covered this a little bit in our networking conversation from 2 weeks ago, but the gateway, or it's often called the router, is the place where if there's a message that's sent to an IP address that the network doesn't know exists, it goes to whatever is set to the gateway or the router for the way that we use our closed systems. So it's kind of the party line for the network, right? It allows you to get packets that have no known destination out and picked up by other devices.
And then Jeff asks, does the file transfer only apply to a device that just came online? For example, I just added a remote during the show as to prior to the show.
Yeah, so when we talk about sessions in a little bit, every time we add a device, you know, it has to synchronize in the session, right? So if a session is happening and I plug in a remote video node, for example, it needs to pull down that file. So there's going to be a file transfer from the primary to that client device. Every time we save a show file, the way that works is we save the show file, package it up, get it all ready on the primary, and then we send it out to all of the client devices over the network. So really in a save, if you have a large system, that's where we see a little bit more lag, right? Is that that file is being packaged up and redistributed across the whole system, so that we can make sure that everything's synchronized. So I hope that makes sense.
Justin Freeman asks, why does the undo history go away after a new device comes online to the system?
Hey, Justin. Oh, that's a complicated, sticky one. The undo history will go away when a new device comes online and when you save a show file. And that currently has to do with the fact that, and we'll look about, we can kind of talk about this as we get into other parts of the discussion, but it really has to do with the fact that we keep track of undo by user. And in a network system where multiple users are editing all the same data, that is a really complicated process. And the same thing happens when a new device joins the session, right? So it's something that we very much have on our list to fix. We get comments all the time about, like, why when I save does my undo history go away? It actually has to do with the fact that multi-console systems, multi-user systems, undo gets quite complicated. However, we understand that that's frustrating when you're in a single console environment. So it's something that we'd like to tackle at some point. I'm not going to commit to any timeline because that's not my purview. But we know why it's there, and we hope to fix it at some point. So cool. Shall we move on?
Sure.
Cool. So the next topic is going to be talking about just session configuration. You know, how do we get a session together? How do we decide who does what? What are the roles of all the devices? All that fun stuff. So session configuration. First, we got to know what a session is. And a session on a network is a primary console and any connected backups or clients, right? So when we talk about a session, we talk about a console group. We're not talking about output devices like gateways, dimmer racks, anything like that. We're talking about Eos Family devices that can share show file information, right? So your gateways are always just on the network listening. They don't know that an EOS console is online and outputting. They don't know that a client is connected. They don't really care, right? They're just listening for ACN or ArtNet or whatever protocol they're set to. So I think that, there's some misconceptions on that. So a primary console, backup, clients, we're good to go. And a session is not the same thing as a network, right? We can have multiple sessions existing on the same physical network, right? A primary and all of its connected devices with its show file and everything can be on the exact same physical network as another primary with a bunch of its connected devices. And those two sessions will just sort of politely ignore each other, right? They're not going to interfere with each other's communications. So there are scenarios like in TV studios where we have like floating control rooms where we need to be able to get any control room paired up with any studio, where we like to have multiple sessions on the same network. So there are things that we do, but things that can be part of sessions are things like things that aren't a part of sessions, but need management are things like show control devices, and again, things like output devices. So if you do get into a situation where you're using multiple sessions on the same network, you need to coordinate that, right? Which gateways are listening to which session? Should this session have, just universes 1 through 100, and this session 101 through 200? If you're dealing with show control gateways, what groups are they assigned to? And maybe you only use those groups in certain spaces. So, it's with great power comes great responsibility. You have to do a lot more coordination if you're doing it. And again, I think that's a special scenario. We're not seeing a lot of people do it. What we usually see is that people are in a theater and they're booting up their console, and maybe someone comes in that's unfamiliar with the way the system is set up, and I've powered on the console up in the booth, and it's designated to be the primary, and I have a new electrician today who's not been in the system. They come in, and they are at the desk for programming in the house, and they're like, oh, I'm going to launch this as primary as well. Now I have two sessions on the same network. And the kind of disappointing part right now is we don't give you any warning on either session that there's multiple sessions active. So you have to be a little bit careful. And what happens in theaters in particular is you power down everything the night before, you come back in the next day, two consoles get powered on as primaries, and now they're both outputting the same thing to the rig because they were both in the same queue when you powered down last night. But now I start programming and changing queues or hitting go on one of them. So it's contributing different information than the primary that's up in the booth, and they're not communicating. So what you get is some lights change, some lights don't. And this can be a really frustrating situation to troubleshoot. Why are some of my lights changing and reacting and some aren't? And it's because two primaries are online and the gateways are taking highest takes precedence per address. Make sure you're checking on that stuff. When we talk about programming console systems to power on and power off remotely, that's a way to kind of get a workflow together. But be aware this is something that happens with some fair regularity, and be prepared to troubleshoot it and make sure that all your devices are assigned the role that you expect them to be. Okay. There are a bunch of session roles that are available. So this is a graphic from the shell, right? What role is my device going to come in at? Your primary is the boss, is the grand poobah, right? So with a primary online, it's in charge of data output, It also handles all of the show file and synchronization between any device that's connected to it in the session. It's the device that fires automated and background tasks, right? So if you fire something that is background related or something that happens automatic through time code or real-time clock or something like that, that always happens on the primary. Any triggers that come into the system, show control, communications with remotes, the primary is it, right? So you know, what's great about this is that if you're in a standalone system, you can think about the fact that the one desk you have online does all the tasks. That doesn't really change in a multi-console system. You're adding other devices that you can interact with it, but the primary is still in charge. The primary still handles all of that data management. And we'll talk a little bit about in a moment that your session role, and which is primary versus which is backup, has nothing to do with your work environment. So I can do all the same amount of work on any device regardless of its session roles. Session roles only determine what device is in charge of the rig. I wouldn't want maybe my puck to be a primary if I'm using that as remote video, because I'm turning that on and off all day. So think about what devices you want. The primary has to be on for remotes to connect. The primary has to be on for data to be output. So while the workflow doesn't matter, it does matter which devices are on versus which devices are going to be coming on and offline. So consider that. Your next session role is a backup. And the backup just sits there and tracks what the primary is doing. I like to think of it as a little, like an annoying little brother, right? So it sits online and all day, all the time, it just says to the primary, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing now? Hey, how about now? Hey, what are you doing now? What's up? What are you doing? And it's fully tracking that information and keeping control, or keeping an exact duplicate of the state of the show file, the state of playback, the whole environment. So so the backup's job is really just to sit there and make sure that it's getting everything that the primary is doing. It also is in charge of monitoring the health of the primary. And we'll talk about this in a failover. You know, a primary, it's not just making sure that it's tracking what it's doing, but it's also saying, hey, what are you doing? And it expects certain responses from the primary. So if the backup says, hey, what are you doing? And at a certain point, it gets a response from the primary that it doesn't expect, that's garbled, or it doesn't get a response from the primary, we go into what is known as a failover situation, and then there's behavior that you can choose as to what happens when the system realizes it's in failover, right? So backup, getting track of all the stuff, making sure that the primary is healthy and operating. And then every other device that comes in is a client. A client is a real-time portal into the session, right? So it doesn't have any processing responsibilities, which is why we can bring in so many clients. It also doesn't have to be as heavy duty of a machine, right? So I can have something like a TI 24K, and I can bring my little laptop in, and it's just basically a remote desktop almost to my primary, right? I can go in, I can make changes to the show file, I can change what's being played back or not being played back, I can move subs, I can move lights, I can store things. It's a full client into the session in the computer term of client, right? So again, no processing power, but you can do all the same amount of work potentially that you could do at anything with primary or backup roles. So keep that in mind. There's a new one for 3.0. You have the ability on Nomad to select an augmented tether. This doesn't come in as a session device. What a tether does is it pairs itself to an existing device in the session, right? An augmented tether isn't a standalone device. It is communicating only with an individual console. So we're basically using the tethered device's processing and display, and kind of handcuffing it to an individual device. So that is something that allows you to expand specifically for augmented. But it doesn't count as its own session role in the same way that primary, backup, and client do. But I wanted to cover that because it's new. And then finally, offline, a device that can be physically connected to the network, but isn't communicating with the session. So if you need to work on another show file for whatever reason, you're on a break, you can go offline, do whatever you want to do, and then when you rejoin the session, it will download the file from the primary and get you back in sync with the session. So offline is really, really useful, even when you're connected to a network. So session limits. How many of each of these things can we have in a single session? You're allowed one primary, right? We only want one boss, one thing that's in charge of everything. Again, in a standalone system where all you have is one console, this is it, right? You have one primary, you have no backups, you have no clients, and away you go, right? So, so one primary on the system. And similarly, we allow you one backup. We allow you to have one thing following the primary. Should the primary go away, have issues, the backup can then take over that processing role, right? And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Clients. We allow you to have up to 99 clients. I would be cautious. You know, your biggest crunch in 99 clients is going to be the bandwidth of your network, right? So while that is possible in the system, it may not be advisable, right? But what we are seeing is more and more client devices being added. You know, if you were in Justin Townsend's chat last Monday, a week before, you know, some of the Broadway shows, you know, a dozen, you know, 18 clients is just not that big of a deal. Again, so many people need views into the system in team lighting, and then so many more people outside of team lighting are wanting views. So this is where clients are really useful, and we're constantly working on improving the ability of clients to stay synchronized in a thinner way as we see systems grow. So that's your technical limitation there. Offline, you can have as many as you want, right? Because they're not part of a session, there's no synchronization, it doesn't matter. Even if a device is physically connected to a network, it's not going to be doing anything if it's not trying to communicate with a primary. And again, just as we talked about the augmented tether, you get one tether per device. So if I'm using a laptop or another machine to tether, that just gets tethered to my one console or whatever. So so keep that in mind. So really quickly, let's talk about plugging two things together really quickly. So I've got a primary and I've got a client without a Nomad key. What that will get me is mirror mode only, right? Mirror mode is a mode that once you are logged in, it doesn't matter your session role. A primary can mirror a client, right? Mirror is a working mode. It's not a processing mode. But without a dongle, we get you into mirror mode only. You can't interact with the system. You can only mirror the primary, right? We're going to show you exactly what's going on the primary screens. However, if you do have a license key, if you do have a Nomad dongle, now you're a full client. Now you have the ability to come in, make changes, change playback, edit the show file, do whatever you want to do. You're fully operational. So if you expect to be doing that stuff with Nomad software, you will need a license key in order to do that. Right, full client privileges. So other devices, things that ETC builds, have our license keys built in, right? Our consoles, Puck is a good example. So by nature of connecting it to a primary, you have full access to being a full client on the system. So that's a great thing. You don't need to do anything else. There are lots of options. That was a weird transition. So that's clients. When you want to start talking about backing up a desk, again, this is something that we want to do. It's live performance. We never want to lose a show because somebody spilled a Coke in the desk or kicked out a network plug or stepped on a Weber switch and turned it off. Not that those have ever happened to me. We want to make sure that we're backed up. So a Nomad with a license key can be a backup. You can actually bring it in and back up a primary device. Same with a puck, right? So Nomad puck doesn't need a license key because it's built in. Other devices that can be backups are Ion XEs and RPUs, right? So the Ion family can back up, and TI, Geo, F5, EOS RPU, right? So any of these devices that you see in this screen can be a primary, or they can back up a primary, right? And that's really useful. Again, with rental shops having what they have based on what's available, you can use any of these devices to be primary or backup. You'll notice that Element is not a part of this. Element cannot join a full EOS session. Element is allowed to be backed up by another element, but you are unable to be able to back up an element into the session. And that includes joining as well. You can't join as a client. That's because Element has a truncated set of features in it. And so you don't have access to as many things. We can't bring that into the same session, okay? The thing that you need to remember, though, is when you are trying to back something up, whatever that device is, it's going to have an output count, right? So if my primary is an unlocked TI, and it's able to output 48 universes worth of data, I need to be aware of what device I'm choosing to back that up. Nomads and pucks can only be 1K or 6K, right? Base or unlocked. Ion XEs can only go up to 12K. And your EOS RPUs and all of your desks with built-in touchscreens can go up to 24K. So back to our simple system where I have a primary and now I'm bringing on a backup. That's great. That's something that I want to do. I want a safe system. But if my primary is 24K and my backup is 6K, what I actually get out of my rig is 6K. As soon as a backup and a primary device enter into that relationship, we are going to reduce the output of the session to the lowest common device, right? So that's something that you need to be aware of, right? If I am outputting 48 universes worth of stuff and I bring on a 6K, then I am only outputting the first 6K of addresses, right? This is very intentional. We don't want you to have to decide if your primary fails, which 6K is going to back up, because that may change moment to moment, day to day. You're not going to be able to figure it out in the panic of hardware failing. So when you're choosing something, oh, that's very important. I'm sad now that that's not working. So when you're choosing a backup, make sure that you're considering what you actually need to output to your rig, right? If I need 24K, then I need a primary and a backup that can handle that, right? So that is a situation where we'll be happy. So just be aware of that. It can catch you when you're least expecting it. And now when I add stuff to my session, anything that's a client, again, because it doesn't have a processing role, doesn't matter. If my puck comes in as a client, it doesn't matter what its output capacity is. It only matters if it is deemed a primary or a backup, okay? So bring in all your devices. I have a thing here where I have my Ion XE as a client. Again, the quantity doesn't matter. I'm just using that as a remote programming station, maybe as a deck console or something like that, okay? So that is a larger session. Before we go into health and failover, what kind of questions do we have about general sessions?
Nick, I think this is something we had mentioned right before we started. Did you go over the matching software versions? We have a question about using Classic Ion, and I think it would be a good
Nope, I
clarification
sure
for that.
didn't, because I saved it on my computer and then I didn't re-upload the new PowerPoint. Yeah, one of the things that's key, in addition to getting all your network settings right and making sure everything's good, is all of your devices have to be on the same software version for them to connect to each other, right? You cannot connect devices that are on different software versions because the features may be different, the show file structure may be different, right? We're constantly adding and changing things as we iterate software. So having devices at the same software, they won't connect to each other, right? They won't do it. This becomes particularly important now that we're releasing 3.0. When 3.0 releases, 3.0 will not be able to be installed on XP-based devices, right? So if you have certain Ion Classics, certain Element Classics, Eos Classic, some RPUs and RVIs, if they can't install 3.0 and you have a device that can, that means that those devices will not be able to be in the same session together, right? So let's do a hypothetical. I bought an Eos Classic and an RVI, 100 years ago, and they're both Windows XP based devices. Since then, I've replaced my Eos Classic with an EOS TI. Great, we love it. And I've still been using that RVI. That will continue to work as long as you sit on 2.9.x software or below. As soon as you upgrade that TI to 3.0, your Windows XP based RVI can't install 3.0. So it will not be able to join a session with that TI. One of the reasons in the shell we left the ability, for those of you that have played with 3.0, when you install 3.0 on a console, you get an option in the shell to switch back to 2.9.x mode. And the reason that we allow you to do that is so that if you have devices that can't get to 3.0, you can very easily get down to 2.9 mode, right? So it's not something that's ideal, but with the way that everything has moved in technology, we had to let XP be left behind in our development. And multi-console, that will matter, right? So once you've installed 3.0 in your system, the biggest thing to look at is whether your device, your Ion, your RVI or RPU, if they have one network port, they will not be compatible with 3.0. If they have two network ports, they will be able to be compatible and install 3.0. EOS Classic is the exception. Those 4 ports are actually just a switch to a single network card. And so EOS Classic cannot update to 3.0 as well. So that is going to be something that if you want the features that are in 3.0, and you're using multi-console systems or you're renting equipment, you're going to need to make sure that they're capable of running 3.0. Again, there's nothing wrong with 2.9. We are just considering 2.9 feature complete for Windows XP machines. So if you have any further questions about that, we can either answer at the end. I'm always happy to take emails, but that does affect multi-console systems. So thank you for that, Sam.
Great. A lot of questions coming in. Starting at the top, Mark asks, if your primary is an RPU or any product, should you keep it running 24/7, or how often should you restart it?
Yeah, so remote processing units are, we use medical grade equipment for the stuff we build RPUs and consoles out of. I know lots of venues that leave RPUs on all the time, and that's totally fine. As long as there's proper ventilation wherever it's rack mounted, as long as you're going in every once in a while and making sure the fans are cleared and cleaned and all that sort of stuff, those devices can run, for months and months at a time. I would say that before I get to that, a good reason for that is if your console is up in your booth and that's a hike to get up to your booth to turn on stuff, and you walk in through the dock door every day, let's say, having your primary on when you walk into the back of the venue means that you can start using the remotes immediately, right? again, if a remote's going to be used, a primary has to be on. So a lot of people will leave that primary on, shut down their desk because they don't want screen burn-in and power consumption and things. But the primary, your RPU as the primary can just stay on and click. I would say if you're going to be dark for any length of time, it's good to power it off, right? It is still an electronic device that's taking a hit from the power grid. UPSs help that, but physically hitting the rocker switch on your power supply will physically disconnect the power from the source. And so for holiday breaks and things like that, if you're going to be on for 2 weeks or something, feel free to physically shut those down to help save the power supply. The other thing is restarting. They're computers, and if you are playing a show back, 8 nights a week, 2 matinees, whatever, you're probably not going to need to restart it as often, but maybe every 3 to 4 weeks, you'll want to restart it, make sure that the memory gets cleared and all the processes load fresh, and it should be fine. If you're in programming, if you're in tech, where a lot of data and a lot of things are changing on the device, on the hard drive and the memory, you'll want to restart it more often. Maybe restarting it every couple of days would be good. And also doing a deep clear, right? In the tech process, our buffer, where we store stuff temporarily before we save it to a show file, deep clear just erases that little buffer. So make sure your show file is saved. It will be safe on the hard drive. Do a deep clear to clean that up, and then reload the show file. And if you do that as primary, it'll be easy to get all that stuff sent out to other devices. So those are good maintenance tips, I think. But keeping your primary online, if it is an RPU, is pretty safe, and lots of venues do it.
All right, next question. Elias asks, sorry if I butchered your name. On a network with multiple consoles across multiple spaces, is there a way to pin or password protect your primary console from being accessed from a client in another room that is working on a different show?
No, not currently. So if you have a standalone console, and you don't want that happening, you could uncheck that multi-console box in the shell, right? This would be a really good example of, I don't want other devices able to connect to my device. I can turn off that multi-console checkbox, and that'll disallow it. What it's not going to prevent is if you have, and we see this more and more, where 2 spaces are on the same network, regardless of whether or not they're in the same session, they'll still be able to talk to any universes they're allowed to talk to, right? So if universe 1 is my demo racks in space 1 and universe 2 is my demo racks in space 2, there's nothing that says that I can't patch or bring up addresses in universe 1 in space 2, which will affect this space over here. You can do some stuff with some really complicated networking things, but the shorter answer is to go into that settings area in the shell that says allowed output, and in your desk in space 1, you should limit the output to only talk to the addresses that are in space 1, and then the same thing in space 2. And that will prevent them from cross-talking, because again, once the levels are out on the network, things like gateways aren't a part of a session. They're just listening for data. So they don't know that they're in room A versus room B. They don't know that they're connected to console A versus console B. They're just passively listening for whoever is giving them information. So I hope that helps.
Great. Sorry, juggling a couple things here. Next question. How does backup console, I mean, this is getting a little ahead of us, but I think we can note it if you know the answer. How does backup console affect network when backing up Augment 3D objects?
It really just has to do with show file size. When we talk about backup stuff and transferring, it's going to be the same process, right? All of the augmented information is stored in the show file. You're just going to have a larger show file, so it may take a bit more time to save. I know that the development team, because we're still in beta for 3.0, the development team is working on optimizations to bring all that stuff down and make it fast as possible. But functionally, it's not going to affect how stuff gets shot across the network. We're just going to have larger show files. Good question.
Next question from Robert Broderson. Does the speed of data transfer need to be the same between devices on a network? Baud rate, fastest, etc.
So there aren't any settings in EOS software that I'm aware of that allows you to change that stuff from a network standpoint. If you're talking about the fast file transfer and stuff like that, ideally those would match, just because the devices will be able to give and receive files at the same pace. So that would be something that you'd want to coordinate between certainly your primary and your backup, right? But regarding like baud rate, I think the only things that we allow you to adjust that sort of stuff is for like serial protocol and stuff, and that's a show control thing. But also you'll want to make sure that obviously if you have a device that's a 10/100 switch and you have a 10/100/1000 console, you're going to have some slowdown in file transfers. So your switch gear is going to be key to passing this information quickly. You want to do a couple more?
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of see if I can bunch things up a little bit just to kind of get what people are looking for. Let's see. So there's a couple questions here about kind of limiting clients' abilities. So when giving clients to, say, the video team, can the primary control that client? Can you remotely control clients to allow or not allow them to do things? And there was another question that was asking about the difference between limiting outputs for a specific client and partitioning.
Yeah, we'll talk about partitioning near the end of this, further into this. The short of it, and this will make a little bit more sense when we go through users and partitions, we do not have security logins, right? There's no way for me to say, if someone knows what they're doing on a device, that I can prevent them from doing that, right? There are a couple of things that we can do to lessen that so that people don't accidentally do things. But right now, the console system does not have any sort of what we would consider a security login and permissions, right? So I can't be in a session with Rob Crane and Sam and say, Rob can't record anything, Sam can't change patch. That's something that's on our roadmap. It's something we really want to get to, but it's not there. So when we talk about partitions kind of help you prevent some of that, but it doesn't prevent me from going to a different partition if I really want to do it, right? So kind of no, but there are some tools that help you curate how people are doing it, right? Right now, we kind of expect that everyone who is interacting on the system is at some level of professionalism. And I know that's always not the case, but when we give people a device, we're giving them access to our system. And you need to be comfortable with that if you're giving them their device. Things like full screen magic sheets can help. Things like not providing a touch screen can help. Not providing pointing and keyboard devices can help, right? But at the end of the day, if there's a will, we're going to let them do it. So, cool.
Great. Do you want to do any more questions, or do you want to push through and we can do another round of questions later?
Yeah, let's go through and talk about sort of the rest of systems, which is health and failover, right? And then we'll get into some of the programming questions, right? Once we've gotten a healthy session going and we understand how failovers work, then we can talk about some of the programming stuff. Healthy system, right? I've got a primary, I've got a backup, I've got a client, and a key thing is that I have a gateway, right? Even if you just have two devices in a system, I think we talked about this in our networking session 2 weeks ago, but if you have a primary and a backup, if one of them fails, the other device needs to be able to talk to the outputs, right? So as soon as you create a backup, you need a gateway, right? So you immediately go from one device to three devices. If your DMX is hard plugged into your primary and it fails, then there's no point in having a backup, right? The backup can't talk to the DMX from a dead console. So things like show control need to be on a gateway if you expect them to work in a full tracking backup situation, output, all that sort of stuff. We'll talk about it in a second, but clients also track who is in charge of the rig, right? So in a healthy system, in your network status bar, and I didn't go through, I should have gone in and like done all the right color coding because there's color codes for a lot of this stuff too. But in your network status bar, which is above your CIA, in a healthy system, you have a couple of indicators. You have user one. We'll talk about users in a second and what they mean. And on your primary, you have primary and master. And on your backup, you have backup and tracking, right? So your second slot, your user one is your user, but your primary master, your primary, your backup, and your client are the assigned roles, right? What did I log into this device and what is it supposed to be doing? My primary is supposed to be in charge of the rig. My backup is supposed to be tracking the primary and making sure that it's healthy, right? Great. So in a healthy system, your third option that's going to be displayed there is your master, right? So master says, I am in charge of the rig, right? I'm the primary. I'm supposed to be in charge of the rig. I'm the master. I am in charge of the rig, right? So I'm all good. Again, in a healthy situation, I'm a backup. I'm supposed to be tracking the primary. I am tracking the primary, right? So backup, tracking, away you go. And you'll notice that client has master behind it. And that's because the client is always following whoever the master is. So we'll look at that in just a second, right? In an unhealthy situation, right, if for whatever reason my primary goes away, I kicked out a network plug, there was a power outage on that side of the building, whatever reason this device has gone offline, I'm now in a situation where the backup is still trying to track the master. You'll get a notification on the backup and actually on the primary that says, we've lost communication with each other. What do you want to do, right? There's a couple of things that were out in our shell that have to do with what happens in this situation, right? This is considered a failed system, right? The backup is trying to communicate with primary. It can't. It says, hey, we're in a failover state. And in a failover state, there are a couple of options, right? Remember our checkboxes? Backup automatically takes over. If this checkbox is enabled in the shell, then the backup will, as soon as it knows that it's in a fail state, become the master, right? It knows where the primary was when it went away. It knows what was going on. It says, I'm supposed to be tracking the primary. The primary's gone away. I am going to be the master, right? So it will start outputting to the rig. It will start responding to show control. It will start running background states. It will do all the stuff that the primary was doing because it is now the master, right? The other setting that affects failover in the shell is that backover takes over at a higher priority. Why does this exist? This checkbox exists because if the primary has actually not gone away, but is instead just unhealthy and spewing garbage, if a backup takes over and it's at the same priority, the gateways are going to be hearing all the ACN data at the exact same priority and doing highest takes precedence. And that can be a problem, right? So if your primary is still spitting out garbage, your backup can't do anything. Backup takes over at higher priority, takes whatever the primary's priority was, let's say it's 100, and just adds 1 to it. So if this box is checked and the backup takes over, it's going to automatically change its priority to 101, and now it will crush whatever is being contributed at priority 100, right? So this can be a good thing. This can also be a bad thing. What if you have a paradigm system that is also controlling things like house lights, work lights, and things that are shared control between paradigm and between Eos? If your paradigm was set to priority 100 so that HTTP worked between your primary and your paradigm system for your house lights, for example. Now, when you go to 101, your HTTP won't work. Nothing that paradigm is contributing will be listened to because it's at a priority of 100 and your console is at a priority of 101. So you have to be really, really careful checking this box because it can cause real issues. I won't go through every possible scenario and solution because everybody's system is different, but suffice to say that I really recommend testing a failover when you're in a safe situation, right? Take your primary offline, see what a failure situation does, try a couple of these settings, see how a failed session restores, get comfortable with it, right? It's practice just like anything else. You don't want to be stuck not knowing how this function works in the console when it happens, right? So when you've got some time, try failing over a backup and a primary. You don't need clients really. They're not really involved in this process. So just make sure you're comfortable with it. Be really, really careful about the backup takes over higher priority. That can cause big issues on your system that won't be evident until it happens, right? So once we've done that, again, the backup will turn itself to the master. It says, I'm in control of the rig, and your client is following the master, right? Clients don't follow the primary, clients follow the master. So you'll get some indication on your network screen on your client that it's following the backup, and that way you know that your system is in a state of unhealth. There's a couple of other things that are useful here for a failed system. There's a macro which you can set, which is when a disconnect happens. So if you do a disconnect macro in setup, that will fire when a primary and a backup have failed when we're in a failure scenario. That is useful if you're maybe not near a device. Maybe you are working on stage and you need to know if your system is unhealthy. You're in a studio where you're not near the console. Maybe you have a sub that fires a red light bulb in a corner of the room that just starts kind of flashing to let you know the system's unstable. So whatever you can do with macro, you can do with the disconnect macro, and that happens when the system sees that it has failed. So when we have a failed session, what do we do to restore it? When the device comes back online, right, let's say, for example, I had just tripped out the network cable and I plug it back in and away I go. When you plug in your primary, which was previously your master, at that very moment, it still thinks it's the master, right? It hasn't seen the backup. So depending on how slow your network connection is and how quickly these devices can negotiate, you may have two devices outputting to the rig at the same time, right? And that can cause problems, right? If your backup has advanced several queues or whatever. So the failover is intended to be very much a one-way switch. If your system fails and you're in the middle of a performance, for example, if you've determined what's wrong, before you try and restore your system, you should wait until you're in a safe place. Wait till an intermission, wait till the end of the show. The system has failed, it's unstable, the backup's in control, it's doing its job, let it be, right? By restoring the system, and we're gonna talk through this, and I'm gonna talk to you what happens, but we should, again, if you have time, you should play with this yourself. This is a moment where you don't want two devices outputting to the rig, right? So get to a safe place, get to an intermission, and away you go. As soon as the primary sees the backup, though, it is going to stop being a master, right? It will immediately stop outputting. It says, aha, I see my backup again. It's the master. I'm letting it stay, right? So if for whatever reason your primary does come back online and your backup is the master, that master will go away and your user one primary will be there, right? So that's a good thing. You will also get dialog pop-ups, which say in this moment, you know, I see the primary, right? And on the backup, it'll say that, and on the primary, it'll say, I see the backup. So you know that they're communicating again, but the backup is still the master. You will then be given an option, depending on which device you're on, the backup of the primary, to either take control or release control, right? So when you take control, that's from the primary, it says, give me back control of the rig. If you're on the backup, it says release control. Something happens in this moment that actually usually only takes a couple of seconds, but I'm going to talk you through. And it's very important. And again, it's why you want to wait until you're not live in front of an audience or you're in a place where just house lights are on or something. Whenever the primary has been gone and it comes back online, when you assert control back to the primary, we assume that the backup has the latest information, right? We assume that the backup has been in control of the rig. If there were any changes, if there were any playback advancements, the backup has the best information. That's not always the right assumption, by the way, but that is the way that the system currently functions. So what will happen as soon as you assert control is the primary will download the show file and the current state from the backup, right? So it will take everything that's happening in the backup in its current state and download it to the primary. As soon as it receives that file, it turns into the master, it starts talking to the rig again, and it re-downloads the file to the backup and all of the clients, right? So it resynchronizes the whole system. Again, depending on the complexity of your system and what's going on and how big your show file is, that could take a couple seconds. That could slow down your network. So this is something that you just want to be sure that your system is healthy. You want to be sure that, you know, if you're running a bunch of like ballyhoos and stuff, you might see a pause in that stuff. You need to be in a safe place before you reassert control. So again, we very intentionally have this set as sort of a one-way switch when you fail. Be really careful when you're asserting control to restore the system to its standard health. Okay. So that is kind of failover. Again, I really encourage you to play with it if you're going to be using this, and ask questions before you get into a situation where something has failed and you don't know how to get it back, or you restore control and bad things happen and you don't know why. Okay. Sam, what kind of questions do we have?
Questions. So starting from the top, CJ asks, so just for clarification, is the backup actually doing processing or just a glorified client that checks in to see if the primary is online?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. So it's constantly surveying and keeping the information. Unlike a client, it has the physical capacity to be a backup, right? We don't let all devices be backups. RVIs, for example, like traditional RVIs, don't have processors big enough to handle that sort of stuff. So a backup always has the processor reserve for whatever its output capacity is, right? That's why we limit pucks to 6K and things like that. So it's a good question, but not all, they're not exactly equal because of hardware restrictions.
A couple of questions here about using other output protocols. How do you handle, this is from Matthew Binkowitz. Hi, Matthew. How do you handle a situation where you have a multi-console system taking something like OSC input from QLab where you need to specify a target IP? Would you have to specify the primary since the backup can't receive OSC?
Yeah, in a lot of these situations, we're actually targeting both the IP of the primary and the backup, right? In a healthy system, you can do that because the backup won't respond to OSC commands, right? So ideally what you would do is send those OSC commands to both IP addresses, and in a healthy situation, only the primary responds to that. In a backup situation, the backup would respond to it. we're looking at other ways that maybe this could be a little bit easier. I don't want to talk too much more about the technical details of it, but right now, trigger protocols that are IP-based are difficult, and we understand that. So that's kind of where that is.
And so I guess this probably may fall under the same answer, which is there a way to push MIDI timecode or other forms of show control from a backup to a primary over the network? Is the solution we're talking about here really just sending whatever that show control is to both output, to both backup and primary, and just letting it take over with whoever has control?
Well, here's the deal. If you're doing timecode, if you're doing SMPTE or MIDI timecode, you want to use a gateway to bring that stuff into the system, right? Again, just like physical DMX, if you have MIDI plugged into a primary and it fails, then it's not going anywhere, right? It's stuck at that connection. However, if you bring in MIDI or SMPTE into a gateway, now it's distributing it through the whole network, and the primary can see it and respond to it when it's supposed to. And if the primary goes away, the backup knows that it's supposed to take over and respond to that stuff, right? So for things like show control, for things like contact closures, where we use an ETC gateway to bring that stuff into the network, that will work fine because the primary and the backup understand that handoff. For things that require IP targeting, like OSC, UDP, things like that, those are where we have to target multiple IP addresses. So it depends on what system you're using, but timecode we only really bring in via our gateways anyway.
The next question. When a backup is the first in the session and the primary is joining later, will the primary load the show file from the backup?
Yeah, and that has happened where, and this is where you got to be careful, in how you power on your devices, because we make the assumption, and again, I don't think it's necessarily the right assumption for every case, but we make the assumption that the backup has the most recent information. So if you power down the backup and you're doing a bunch of work on the primary, and then you power down the primary for the night, and then you turn on the backup, and then you bring the primary back online, you may lose those changes, right? So a way around that is if that happens, hopefully you save that file on the primary and you can reload it. But if you did not save it and it was just in the queue, it's gone. And we've seen this happen in systems and on pretty big shows. And it's a big frustration for people, right? And so we're talking about, and again, I don't want to commit to timeline, but we're talking about allowing you to choose either a default or in the moment, which has the most recent information. The trouble with that is it introduces time, right? If you're not there to see that it happened and you don't have automatic transfer set up, what do? So we need to work through those problems internally, figure out what good solutions are that we can offer, and then code it. So, it's not going to be tomorrow, but it's something that we understand that's bitten people, and it's one of those things that is the way the system currently works. And so be aware of it and try and do things like save often and bringing in your system in a proper order.
Next question from Ben, backup or feature Fickthorn. Why do primary desks lose their file save location when they take control from the backup? Feature or bug?
Bug. It is something, each device basically is remembering its last targeted location. And so by bringing the primary back into the session, it doesn't remember where it was before. There's a lot of nuances between that handover stuff that we could be working on. The fact of the matter is that a lot of those creature comforts for how stuff gets handed over haven't been addressed, and it is stable, it is functional as a failover process. It's robust, but it is a little it's a little bit of a blunt tool, to be honest, right?
Next question, and there are a couple that I think we're kind of in this vein. Is it better for the primary console to be the console one is physically programming on, or is it better to have the primary in a closet somewhere and program on the quote-unquote backup, or vice versa?
Well, we're out of time. Wow, that was
Yeah.
No. We get this question all the time. The fact of the matter is, it really doesn't matter. You know, when we get in the next section we're going to talk about is actually programming on this stuff. The processing role doesn't matter, right? Whether you're programming on the primary or programming on the backup. I know a lot of people have the opinion that they want to be programming on the backup so that if the primary fails, they're sitting at the desk that that is still up. My opinion is that there's no guarantee that the primary is going to be the one to fail, right? The backup has an equal chance of failing. And in fact, if you're programming at a desk and the other desk is safe in a closet, you're more likely to tip over the desk that you're at. So I think just do what feels best for you. The fact of the matter is it really doesn't matter, and I don't think you're really mitigating risks any which way, right? The only compelling thing that I think that matters is if you have something like a remote processor, which is hard to program at because it just has the tiny little buttons. And if it's in a rack, then it's by default safer, and you can also leave it on longer and connect remotes to it and stuff like that. So that's really the only compelling thing that I've seen. If you've got two consoles, doesn't really matter.
And I think one more question from Simon Farrow, question about SACN priority, which we touched on a little bit. If you're in a system with Unison, a primary, and a backup, and your backup takes over at higher priority, what happens at the end of the night when you shut down your backup? Will the Unison work again?
Yeah, that's exactly right. As soon as the backup powers off, it's no longer contributing to the network. So the only source on the network that the gateways would see at that time would be the paradigm, the Unison, and they would go back to responding to that, right? Not to go too far off topic, but kind of what we talked a little bit about in networking, the way that ACN works is that it's up to the receiving device to arbitrate, right? So the gateway is receiving everybody who's contributing to universe one, let's say. So if I've got 5 primaries and a Unison and an MA and a hog, you know, like whatever, I don't know why I do that to myself, but if they're all contributing to universe one, it's the gateway's responsibility to pick whichever device is outputting at the highest priority and translate that to output. As soon as the highest priority device goes away, the next highest priority device, the gateway is going to say, oh, that's the highest priority device right now. I'm going to start outputting that. So I've developed, worked on a couple systems that are complicated where a Unison system was at a priority and they brought in another console at a higher priority, and then but that console would intermittently stop outputting ACN, and so Unison was temporarily taking over, and in this case, shutting off all the relays to the moving lights, which was a bad thing. So we had to make some control choices about how that was working because the console was turning off its ACN for certain portions of its operation, and the gateways and the receiving devices don't know any better. They just say, highest priority is gone, I'm going to start outputting the next priority. So good question.
Next one, yeah. I think this one is an important clarification for everyone about backups. When backup takes over, is it continuing on from the same queue as the primary, or do you need to load it into the backup's GM?
The answer is whatever user you're in, and we'll talk about that in a second. If you're in the same user as the primary, you're good to go. But the master fader is user by user. So we'll cover that in some more detail in a bit. But it's important.
Great. I think let's push ahead, and then we'll try to get to these other questions.
Yeah, again, I'm going to try and, I know some of you want to go to hog. I'm going to try and wrap this up probably in the next 10 to 12 minutes so that we have time for questions, and anybody who wants to head over can head over. So I I hope it's useful. Thanks for all the questions so far. So some of the stuff, we get a session going, right? We got our backup, we got our primary, we got our clients, everybody's working, everybody's happy. The network is there, right? Believe it or not, that's all that stuff was before this, the past, 90 minutes. There are now some programming things and some tools that help us specifically with multi-console sessions. And some of them are in the shell first. The checkbox, starting EOS in your shell or your ECU. If this is unchecked, the device is going to automatically launch the EOS software, right? It's not going to stop at the little grid of options, and it's going to try and connect to whatever primary it was last connected to, right? So for example, if I've got an RVI and all I want to do is have the designer sit at it, not interact with anything, I want it to power up, I want it to be there, I'm there a half hour before the designer is powering things up, it just needs to work. I can have this disabled, and because I've previously connected it to my primary, it will just automatically launch, and as long as it sees that primary, it will connect to it. So this is something, again, about sort of the order in which you power stuff up, and we'll talk about that stuff in a little bit. So that's a useful thing, right? If I have a device that I want to wait until I have the rest of the session up, or I might be changing its role day to day, I can have it open in the shell and change it. So that's what that does. Decide what's right for the device, and away you go. The other thing that's right below there is automatically update software. As we said, anything that's going to be in the same session has to be on the same software. If your automatically update software checkbox is enabled, if a device has been connected to a primary before, and if it sees that it is on a lower level of software, and this checkbox is enabled, it will download the software from the primary, it will install it, it will restart, and it will reconnect to the system, right? So this is actually really, really useful, right? It means that in a properly configured session, I only need to update the software on my primary, right? I power it up for the day. I don't power anything else up. I go through, I update my software, I get my show file loaded, and then I can power on my other devices, and they will just take care of themselves. So it's a pretty useful tool if you are in a venue where you have clients all over the place, or you're in a studio where your devices are rooms and rooms apart. So know that is a useful tool. The other thing is remote power startup and shutdown. We talked about this at the very beginning. And I didn't take a screen grab of this, and I should have, so sorry. In your network area of your browser, right? You go into browser, there's a file tree called network, and in there, there are two things that say basically fire a remote startup and fire a remote shutdown. Those commands can be stored into macros, right? So that's a useful thing. So when you fire one of those remote startups, any device that's on the network that has remote startup enabled, as long as it's still connected to a power source, right? As long as it's just soft shutdown, it will get the wake on land command, and it will boot up, and it will either stop at the shell or it will continue through, right? Same with shutdown. Any device that has the remote shutdown checked, if somebody fires a remote shutdown, then it will shut itself down. I think the biggest thing you need to ask yourself is, are both of these needed for every single device, right? Do I want remote shutdown accessible on my primary and my backup? Probably not, right? I don't want somebody to accidentally fire a macro in my system and then the whole system goes down, right? So be cautious with these things. Be thoughtful about how you deploy them. I think a really good practice is to have, your clients all have remote startup and remote shutdown enabled. Make a decision whether or not you want your backup to have remote shutdown enabled or not. I think remote startup's great. And again, what it will allow you to do is walk into your primary, power it on, or if it's already left on, like an RPU, you can fire that remote startup, and now your whole system powers up, gets ready for the day. If you have something like a macro, remember that occurs when the device that's handling background functions starts up, right? So your startup macro isn't going to fire on each individual device as it starts up. It's going to fire on your primary. So if your primary is already on and you want to fire snapshots on devices, you might need to build a macro that both calls a remote startup and fires snapshots after a certain amount of time. So play with that sort of stuff if you're looking to automate your system startup or shutdown, but there are features that are pretty useful, and be diligent and cautious as to how you deploy them based on each device. Another session tool useful, and I kind of just talked about this, is remote macros, right? In the macro editor, you can set a macro to target a user number or a device. So we'll talk about users in just a second. But basically I can say, and this was boring because I screenshotted it on my laptop, so it's just my laptop. But if I had multiple devices in there, I could say, I want this RVI to fire this snapshot. I want the next RVI to fire the next snapshot. I want to make sure my backup fires a snapshot and it is in the same user, my primary. Whatever stuff I want to do, I can do that. And I think remote macros are used not just for startup. You know, it's happened before where the designer's at the RVI and they start arguing with the choreographer and they throw their notebook down and it hits the keyboard and now their displays are all messed up. With these remote macros, I can use a snapshot that I can fire on their device so that they go, oh, my screens are all messed up. I can take care of that for them. They don't have to worry about that. There's a couple of options. You can fire remote macros on the backup, on the master only, on all users but me, by user number, or on individual devices, right? So think about how you might use those and what you want to do, but they're really intended for multi-console sessions, right? So there you go. Users. We get a lot of questions about users. Users are just kind of workspaces, right? I consider EOS in a multi-console environment like an office, right? You are all sharing the same copier, you're all sharing the same printer, but my cubicle, I might have some tools that are just mine. And I might just have my own stapler and you have your own stapler, right? So users aren't security-based, right? They are just workspaces. They are a place for you to do certain tasks without interrupting other people on the system. So in your network status display, as we showed, you see where your user is. A couple of builds ago, we introduced a thing where you can click on that and it will pop up all the users that are in your system so you can quickly change between users. So that's useful. You know, like I was saying before, it doesn't matter what the session role of the device you're on is. If you want to be user 4 on the primary or you want to be user 1 on the primary, it doesn't matter. The primary doesn't have to be user 1. The backup doesn't have to be user 2. These are just for workflow, right? So just kind of realize that those things are completely separate. We don't care. Users are all about working. Label your users, and this is a bad example because I didn't do this before taking the screenshot, but your label will show up here too. In your settings area, under system setup, you have the ability to add and delete users, name them, and you can see whether users are online or not in the session. So that's kind of a useful thing to see who's been using them. Users do store in your show file. So if you've created 100 users, well, you can't. If you created 99 users in a show file and you take that to another theater, those users all still exist, right? So just be aware that maybe if you're a little OCD like I am, you might want to go in and purge those if you go from a big multi-console system with a show file down to maybe a system of just 2 or 3 things, right? So what are things that are shared between devices that have the same user ID? The biggest thing is your command line, right? If Rob and I are the same user on 2 different devices, he can type 1, I can type @ he can type full, I can hit enter, and channel 1 will turn on, right? And therefore, you have the most inefficient programming system ever known to mankind. What that actually allows you to do is exactly what someone asked earlier, is to say, I want my backup and my primary to be on the same user, so that if the backup takes over, my primary fails, I can slide my chair over to my backup, and I'm right exactly where I left off. And I know a lot of venues that work that way. However, if we're in a multi-console environment, that's multi-console. That's what this whole thing is about. If we're in a multi-programmer environment where I'm dealing with conventionals and you're dealing with moving lights, sharing the command line's bad, right? So we would want to be in different users. Because we share the same command line, things like selected channels are shared between the same user, right? Channels that are nulled out if you have done live nulls. So just keep that in mind. And any filter states are shared by user. So if you've filtered parameters down, be aware that that's there. Obviously, your selected queue, because that's a part of your command line, as is your live blind mode, right? If we're in the same user, if my designer and I are in the same user because they want to watch my command line, if I go into blind, they're going into blind. So just be aware of that. It's one of the reasons why we give you command line objects on magic sheets, is so that you can track different users and not to be in the user for exactly that. And then anything that's in the user settings of setup is going to be changed by user, right? So what's in the user settings? Your tracking or queue only settings, right? Some of your default timing stuff, right? So be aware that anything that's in user settings is going to change. And if you're changing users in a programming environment, that may affect how you program, right? Just be very, very cautious. I actually know programmers who deploy this to their advantage, where they will keep certain users with different settings the way that they want them, and then go back and forth depending on what they're doing, so they don't have to make those changes in macros or in setup. So just be aware. Things that are specific to individual devices, regardless of user ID, right? Again, if Rob and I are in the same user ID, there are things that are per my device, right? What fader page I'm on, the encoder page that I'm on, display focus, right? If I click on something without involving the command line, that won't happen on both devices, right? And so this is the difference between mirror mode. Mirror mode, everything is exactly the same device to device. If I open a tab and Rob's mirroring me, it's opening on that device. It is basically like a network video splitter, right? Whereas we can be in the same user ID, and if I open a display that doesn't command line, like changing the mode, then that doesn't necessarily happen on Rob's device. So decide kind of what you need for your setup. And similarly, display configuration, right? I can have my PSD look very different than Rob's PSD, and because that doesn't affect the command line, right? So there you go. Things that are identical across different users, because I think this is important to just talk about. Anything that's going out to the rig, right? If I put channel 1 at full, everybody in the session is going to see that channel 1's at full. That is the whole point of being in a session together, is unified output, right? These are no longer individual devices. They are all brain melded, and they're sharing all the same show file information, right? As is any data stored in the show file, right? I don't have my own color palette 1 and Rob has his own color palette 1. If Rob records something in color palette 1, I get it as well. That's advantageous in some areas. That can be disappointing in some areas. So we'll talk a little bit about some thoughts on that in a little bit. And then anything that has to do with playback, right? So if a sub is at 50%, regardless of who put it there, the sub's going to be at 50%. If a queue is in Q5, regardless of who put it there, then it's going to be in Q5. So those are the sorts of things that are specific to everybody, right? And I'm going to go back one because I don't remember if I missed it. As I said, I don't think I put it in here. I might talk about it later. But the other thing to remember is that I think we talked about it later. The fader pages are global. The master fader is by user. So we do have a slide about that. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. So let's quickly talk about partitions and what they are, right? Just because Rob and I are different users doesn't mean anything other than we're not stomping on each other with our work. Rob can still access all the channels. I can access all the channels. So what partitions allow you to do is parse out sections of your channel and allow only certain users to control that, right? So if we're going to work in a multi-program environment, this is why we deploy partitions, right? I will say that I have seen people who are in a single programmer environment. I'm just by myself, I'm programming the whole rig, use partitions to say, I'm just going to program the conventional lights and then the moving lights and then my pixel mapping. And I kind of think that's a waste of time. Partitions don't need to be deployed unless you expect two people to be programming, or if you expect there to be people who you kind of want to give limited access to. We'll talk about that in just a second. There's a little bit of a security feature with partitions enabled. Okay, so partitions are user level, right? So user 1 can only have one partition associated with it. I can only be in partition 1 at a time. If Rob is in the same user as me, he's in the same partition, right? So there's not a way to be in the same user on multiple devices and be in separate partitions because it affects your command line and your programming. You enable partitions in settings, and it's system-wide, right? Either partitions are on for the whole session or they're not. There is no, well, I'm in a partition and Rob's not and all that. If partitions are on, they are on. It affects all the users. And we have some default partitions, right? The default partitions are partition 0. And partition 0 is special in that you have access to no channels, right? And whenever a new device joins, or whenever you turn on partition control for the first time, all devices by default are put into partition 0. And that's a safety thing, right? Again, if I have a client, a designer's plugged in their laptop, I haven't given them permission to do anything. I don't want them involved in stuff. By default, they're going to be put in partition 0. And it's important to know this because partition 0 looks exactly like live. When we look at some partition views in a second, you'll see that channels that are outside of my partition look different than channels that are in my partition. We call partition 0 designer view because we want it to look the same, but we don't want you to be able to access any channel control. So partition 0 is a little special graphically, but it can be confusing if you bring on an RVI or a device and you want to start programming channels and you can't. So just be aware that that's what we do. And you'll see that when we enable partition control, we get that partition label in our network status area. So if you're not getting control of things or you're getting weird errors, check and see if partitions are on and assess that with your area. This is also back in settings where you change what partition you are in, right? You can click on your user settings, click partition, and change it to number 1 through whatever. If you're moving around a lot, again, macrotize this. It's good to go. You can turn partitions on and off with errant disregard, right? It doesn't affect what's stored permanently. It only affects what you're allowed to control and record in the moment, right? So think of it as kind of a filter. Don't think of it as changing any of the data that's stored in your file, because it doesn't. turn it on, turn it off, doesn't matter. If it is on and you're in a partition, it will affect what you're allowed to edit and what you're not. So obviously partitions are most useful if you put partitions with channels, right? So in our partition setup area, we can create these. I just created some really goofy, quick ones for my conventional channels and my moving channels. So if I'm in partition 1, I'm only going to see channels 1 through 499. If I'm in partition 2, I'm only going to have access to my movers. And this is kind of what it looks like, right? If I'm in partition 1, those channels have all the normal stuff that they do. Channels 501 through 510 are not in my partition. I can still see what they're doing, but I have a graphical indication that they're not mine, right? So I know the channels 501 through 510 are on. I know that they're in blue, which maybe is useful reference information. We're still programming the same show, so I may want to know what things are happening other than are in here. But what you get is only the ability to change stuff outside of your partition with a warning, right? So you're not locked out of channels that are outside of your partition. And this is an important safety thing, right? The point is that we want you to be able to turn on lights if you need to. We'll warn you. We're going to say, hey, this channel isn't in your partition. Are you sure you want to do this? But then if you hit enter and go through that warning, we will turn it on. Again, if my conventional programmer has walked away on break and I'm at the desk doing notes and someone falls on stage and management calls for it to be on, I need to be able to get those lights on, right? What's good about that is that I can control those fixtures, right? I can go in and bring them on manually, but I can't store them. So in my partition, if I hit record Q5, everything that's outside of my partition is going to stay manual, right? And this is why we use multiple cue lists for multiple partitions. I'll talk about that in a second. We're starting to run out of time, so it'll probably be quick. You know, if I'm in partition 1, I want my own cue list 1 so that when I record, only the channels in my partition are being stored there. Rob is going to want to store in cue list 2 because he only wants to store his stuff in cue list 2. And partitions prevent us from accidentally recording stuff that each other has brought up, right? So that is sort of the basics. Again, new devices brought in will be assigned to partition 0. Be careful about that. And you can have channels stored in multiple partitions. So for example, if we both need access to the house lights, I can do that. But if we're storing those things, we have to be careful now about how that gets stored because both of us have the ability to record it in our place. You know, you may have a partition where you have a moving light programmer, conventional programmer, but then the electrician has a partition that's everything because they need to be able to access stuff and troubleshoot stuff. So you can absolutely put channels in multiple partitions. Some examples of why we use partition control. Again, what I've been talking about is like having a division between conventional fixtures, LEDs, moving lights, a media server programmer, a special effects programmer. So dividing the work up amongst multiple people so you can get more done more quickly. I know this is how Broadway works. I know a lot of award shows work this way, where there's just too much to do. The rig's too big to be able to do it all at once. So multiple programmers is really, really useful. We see some partitions used for multiple stages, right? Studios, festivals, industrials. You know, this is really good for experiential shows like Sleep No More, where they've got one console running the show, but in order to program and do notes, they have individual spaces broken down. So partitions are really, really useful to help with that. And as I mentioned earlier, when you get into a partitioned world, think about target parsing and think about things that make sense. I kind of like everything matching. So if I'm user 1, I'm going to use partition 1 with the channels that I need. I want to store in cue list 1. I want to put all my subs on fader page 1. I'm going to store all my color palettes in the 1000s, right? That's a way to do it. But because you're sharing all these buckets of data, even though you're storing stuff separately, bring some order to how you program. Playback. What's great about partitions is they do not affect playback, right? If something is stored and I hit go, regardless of whether it's in my partition or not, it's going to play back, right? So partitions are only for recording and updating, right? They let me control with a warning, but I get unfettered control inside my partition, and I get the inability to store. Playback, subs, all of that playback stuff is completely unaffected by what partition you're in, right? It's not a world. MA uses the term world, and they parse this stuff to where you have no control of any of the other stuff. That is not an equivocal thing here. Partitions are built for multiple users, building stuff into the bucket, and then it all gets played back together, right? We're still generally doing unified playback. I mentioned this before, but this is important to remember. Your master playback is mapped by the user, right? Anything that's on your fader page is global. So if I'm on fader page 1 and Rob is on fader page 1, and he puts sub 1 on that first fader, then I see that sub. And that's for all fader pages. But your master fader pair is special, and whatever's loaded on it is the same as anybody who's your same user. That's not to say that you can't have QList 1 loaded into multiple users. That will work. But if your primary is on user 1 and your backup is on user 2, and you haven't loaded QList 1 into user 2 on your backup, it's not going to be there. So just keep that in mind if you're hoping to have uninterrupted playback in something like a theatrical show. And again, cues played back from any console in any partition will play back in their entirety, regardless of what partition you're in. So that's important to remember. A couple of quick things to wrap up here. Again, when you turn off partitions, when we're getting into performance, partitions are there just for storage. They're really there for build. When we go to playback, do we need partitions on? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like if a single operator is going to be doing rig check and maintenance and notes, why do they need the trouble of going back and forth between partitions if they're the only programmer? Maybe turn them off. It has no ill effects on anything that's stored, right? A quick thing, you can link queue lists, right? So this is often how, again, in sort of the theatrical model, the Broadway model, if I've stored all my conventionals in queue list 1, Rob stored all the movers in queue list 2, Sam stored all the effects in queue list 3, or whatever, Q1/execute, Q2/enter will trigger all same numbered queues. So that's kind of how we merge that together. We never actually merge the queue lists that we're storing in. We just have them all play back together. And when you're in tech, when you're doing previews and stuff like that, in your queue list, there's an opt-out mode called solo mode, which allows you to step out of that, right? So if I'm in queue list 2 and they're running queue lists on 1, I don't want my queues constantly playing. I can make solo mode a macro, step out for a bit, and then when I'm ready to rejoin the fold, I can jump back in. So that is kind of everything in a nutshell. I think that we'll answer some questions. The biggest thing here is if you are going to deploy multiple programmers, which is really what partitions are for, you should probably get really comfortable by practicing with these tools. This isn't something that everybody's going to dive into, and that's fine. But again, I encourage you to explore it. And it may be that this part of the desk isn't needed by you. You know, we don't make every feature for every customer. If you're in a single programmer environment, partitions can be burdensome, with the exception of making a partition 0 for my designers and my RVIs, or my sound console or whomever, and then having another partition which just has all my channels for me, the programmer. So that's kind of an overview of partitions. Sam, do we have any partition-related questions?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the partition stuff. First question from Andrew, do blind changes store if it is not your partition?
You get the same confirm. I believe. I think we made some changes to that. I believe you still have to confirm it, but yes, it does. And now I'm doubting myself, so I should check that. But I'm going to go on record as saying, yes, that's how it works. And
On the record.
Pop over and while you're asking me other questions, try this out.
Next question from Robert. Is only the master able to toggle partition control? Or perhaps only users with partition 901 or all channel control can toggle partitions on and off?
Yep, anybody who can get in the setup can toggle partitions on or off, right? Again, we don't have any security settings. So, you kind of have to have people be professionals if you're going to be in this sort of environment.
Question from Joshua Davenport. Is there a way to give a designer a different user partition 0, but also allow them to see your command line?
Yeah, this is exactly why we give you command line objects and magic sheets, right? You can do a little thin magic sheet in one of their displays that is pointed to your user, right? So when you add a magic sheet into an object or into a magic sheet, the target number is the user number, right? So just make sure that that's pointed to your user number and they'll be able to follow along.
A situation from Jeremy. Bar to hit go during tech while not interfering with user 1 programming. For some reason, I can't seem to get user 2 control of the go button on the client. However, if I switch back to user 1, the go button works on the client.
It sounds like the queue list isn't mapped to that user, right? Keep in mind that the master playback is special, right? It is by user. So if you're changing users and you don't have that queue list mapped in the user you're going to, it's not going to work.
That is mostly it for partition related questions. Do you want to field any more in a couple minutes or close up?
Yeah, I did just verify the previous question in my offline editor that it is the exact same behavior as live. So it gives me the warning that says, hey, this is out of your partition. Are you sure you want to do this? And then when I accept that, it stores it. So be cautious and blind. Don't, we throw errors for a reason. Don't just blow through them. Be sure to read them. Cool. What else? I think that's the content. I'm going to stick around and answer questions. It's 1 o'clock, so if anybody's running over to Hog, give them my regards. They've been doing some great classes as well. But I'm going to stick around and answer questions. And thanks for your time, everybody. I hope this was useful. I will do this. If you have more detailed questions, I had the foresight this time to actually put my email up. So feel free to answer. I will answer them as quickly as I can with all the other work that I have to do. But I'm happy to make sure that we get your questions answered. And yeah, so be in touch. Also, if you have ideas for other sessions, we're going to do these as long as we need to do them. So and then maybe even longer. So let us know. So thanks everybody. If you need to leave, otherwise. Sam, what do we got?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Trying to just get to the partition stuff first since it's freshest.
Yeah.
Ryan asks, is it or will it be possible to partition by universe or address?
No. So this is channel level control because it's programming related. It isn't really patch related. I kind of smell where you're going with that. And we have some other long-term ideas about how data gets directed between what I'm assuming you're dealing with multiple spaces. But partitions isn't that solution. But good question.
Connor asks, if a client has output in client mode enabled, does it now have processing responsibility, and does it affect output numbers?
I'm sorry, read that again.
If a client has output in client mode enabled, does it now have processing responsibility, and does it affect output numbers?
For the purposes of this discussion, no, it does not. Basically, what that checkbox does is it allows the local I/O to be on or off, right? So, for example, if I had an RVI backstage and I wanted to power or control some DMX rope light or something, it would allow that card, the physical DMX card on that device, to act as a gateway, right, to output. So technically the card is doing some of the processing, but it's really just turning that back device into a gateway. And the difference is that, you know, that device will never be able to stand alone. If the backup and the primary go away, that client is never going to be able to process its own stuff, right? You also need to consider, if you're doing that, not putting mission critical things on that line, right? Because if that device fails, or if the backup and the primary are off, those devices aren't going to be able to be controlled. So either have like a hold last look setting on those devices, or just know that they'll go off if for whatever reason that device can't be used. For a long time, we didn't allow output from a client. We would say, nope, if it's a client, you can't output because it's not safe if the network gets unstable. But we acquiesced with lots of requests with people that just wanted to use that DMX port as a gateway for convenience, right? They didn't have to plug a gateway right next to it. So that's what that checkbox does. Good question.
Question from Risa. Does a manual time master apply on a per user basis, or is it global? And if it's global, is it HTTP?
The timing master is going to be global because it's mapped to a fader, right? So if you and I are on the same fader page where a rate master is at, then, and assuming we have motorized faders because it's easier, if you move yours up to 75%, then my fader is going to move up 75%. If I then drag it down to 25%, yours is going to be down to 25%. So it's LTP in that whichever one of us touched it is going to win. That can be a good thing and a bad thing, right? It can be good if you want global control of a rig. You're doing like a busking concert where you have multiple programmers playing with stuff on the same stage. That could be useful, but it could be bad if you've got multiple stages and multiple programmers. In that case, you need to use the filter function of that master fader, right? Filter it to the same channels that are that you want to control. So, for example, I would only want to control the rate for 1 through 50. You would only want to control the rate through 51 through 100. Even if we're in partitions, it wouldn't matter because those things are considered playback, right? So my partition being enabled isn't going to affect that. I have to use the filter on the fader to slim that down. So good question.
And Nick, just to clarify on that, they asked that manual timing master. Is it the same answer as opposed to a global effects master?
Sorry, manual timing is by user.
Right, and I'm not sure if that applies to when it's on a fader.
Yeah, do you want to check that out, Rob?
Yeah, I can go.
Here, I've got
fire up my console. Let me try.
Rob's gonna check that out. I am 90% sure that fader should only work in your partition or in your for your we're gonna check it
out. Next question. With multiple users on a system, is there a way to find out what user has manipulated a channel?
Nope. Everybody has equal access, right? There's no security. There's no anything. I say that. There is a thing called diagnostics. So if you press and hold your tab button and type 99 and let go of tab, you will get what's called the diagnostics tab, which has a bunch of information in it, and that includes the history. And there you can see who, it will say user 1, command line, channel 1 at full, enter, or whatever. So yes, you can technically see it, but I think the leading question is actually, can you control that? You can't. If they have access to those channels, they can control those channels.
Next question. Ben asks, how is RDM handled in a primary backup situation? Would older hardware hamper RDM's ability on the network?
It's handled just like any other data, right? The primary in a healthy relationship is in charge of managing RDM communication with the fixtures. So that is the same. If the primary goes away and the backup becomes the master, then it is in charge of dealing with RDM. So that handoff is fluid. Again, when primaries and backups are healthy, they're not being treated as two devices. There's a unified communication with the rig, right? And it's the primary that's handling all that communication. It's only when there's a failure in the primary and the backup becomes the master, do we see that handoff of communication, and it's full and complete, right? Everything that the primary was doing goes over to the backup. So that's that. As far as older hardware, the features of RDM have changed over the years, so it depends on your software version. So the only thing that I can say is that if you have a device that can't be upgraded to 3.0, 3.0 and beyond, there will continue to be changes and improvements in the RDM world. And obviously, if you have an XP-based machine, you just won't have access to those additional features. But so far as age of hardware affecting performance, there's no issues that I know of that would do that.
And just to follow up, Yuli chimed in that About will show user manipulated channel.
Oh, really? That's great to know. I didn't know that.
So, thank you, Yuli.
Thank you, Yuli, for always being there to help.
And then I'm back from my booth right over there. So it is global. So manual timing masters are global between users. But remember that in setup, you can change your manual time, which if the manual timing master is disabled, it defaults back to those setup times, which are per user. So
got it. Good to know.
Next question. Let's see. That's it for kind of the most recent stuff. We have some older questions we can catch up on. Joe Vitti asks, will a client on a laptop be able to receive remote startup and shutdown?
I don't know. We use what's called it's called the Silver Bullet. It's a wake on LAN command that is standard for Windows 7 based machines. So I am unsure if that will work on every machine. I am less sure that it will work on Macs. So that it may be worth looking into wake on LAN commands for your individual setup.
Ken asks, is there any kind of plan to segment remote startup shutdown into different groups that will allow you to shut down only shut down RVI clients, but later shut down backup?
Oh, God, yes. We have had it on the wish list for a long time to be able to do some smarter grouping in sessions to kind of like bring a little bit of order to sessions and categorize devices and things like that. Yeah, it is certainly on the wish list. We have a lot of things that are more critical right now because, again, it's a creature comfort more than it's a necessity. But I would like to see us be able to do that sort of stuff too. I also, just spinning off on my own thing and we talk about this inside with the Eos developers and Anne and Matt, who are the product managers, but a bit more transparency into the session, who's on, who's doing what. Some of that stuff has come in a little bit, but I know Matt Halberstadt is particularly keenly interested in making some advancements in the next year or so in transparency into the session. And so I think you'll start to see some more growth in that area as we kind of, as systems are getting bigger, right? We couldn't have imagined 15 years ago that we were going to need 30 remote video devices for a standard theater show. So things have changed and we're adapting. So I think you'll be seeing some of that kind of stuff maybe not that exact thing, but that trajectory moving forward.
Scott Tusing notes that you can shut down devices using macros to segment the power off process. So that might be a workaround in the short term.
Oh, that's smart. Yeah. So using a macro to target specific devices. Yeah, that's kind of smart. Go ahead, Scott.
Tyler asks, what hardware supports remote startup and shutdown?
Oh, goodness. I believe all Windows 7 image devices do. I think there were some issues with some XP machines, or I could be wrong. If you're having issues where a device isn't responding to remote shutdown or startup, get your serial number from the offending device and call phone support or email them. service@etcconnect.com, because it's not critical, right? They'll get back to you when they can. And they can look into it. I know there are some, I remember from eons ago, we had some devices that weren't responding, and I don't remember whether that was something we were able to fix with code or whether it's hardware related. So if you keep having problems with that, check in with our fine folks in service, and they can dig in deep for you.
Ryan asks, besides parameter count, are there any disadvantages or issues with using Nomad on a PC as a primary?
I hope not. The cautionary thing always is, we develop the software the best we can, and we do as much testing as we can. But if we release new software tomorrow, and then the day after, Google Chrome breaks our playback for some weird reason, then, we're not going to be able to predict that. We can't do comprehensive testing on every PC, on every Mac, with every configuration. So having a machine that's dedicated to that, if you're running live shows, I see no problem running it on a computer that isn't an ETC-based machine. But maybe take some extra precautions about only connecting it to the internet in certain times to do updates, being able to test it a lot, and maybe using another computer as a tracking backup, right? But using your personal laptop where you want updates and changes and stuff to come rather quickly, maybe that isn't your production laptop, right? So no, we do everything we can to make the software stable and robust, but we can only test so many combinations of circumstances. So there's always a bit more of a risk with Nomad devices than there are with ETC dedicated devices, which is actually why we started making the Puck, 5 years ago or so, is because we wanted an affordable, purpose-built computer without a lot of hardware to drive up the cost that ran Eos bulletproof, right? So that's why Puck actually exists. And then what we found out was it was more affordable than our big RVIs. And so we started selling more of them as RVIs, and we stopped making the RVI Classic. So yeah, those little microcomputers are great. And do whatever you feel is appropriate for your risk level, right? I would say if you're running a little dance recital at a local school, if the lights stop working and you have to do the rest of the show under work light, is that okay? Probably. If you're running, a Broadway show and the lights go off and you have to finish under work lights, is that acceptable? Probably not, right? So you're going to pick different hardware and different backup scenarios based on the risk that you're taking, because it's all computers, right? We can test a lot more because all our computers are doing is EOS, but even they can have problems, so build your system accordingly.
All right, 2 more questions that we want to get to.
Yeah.
From Mark Grady, we often help the clients not load the queue list, so pucks will not track with the backup that we are programming on. This is not consistent upon every startup. Is it normal? How do we solve so everyone is following the same queue list?
Yeah, I mean that has to do with the user, right? So again, you can use a macro to target a device to set it into a user. So if someone has changed their user on a device, then it's not going to have it. So I would say making sure that you set up users for everybody that needs their own discrete workspace, and then making sure that those users are loaded at the top of the day.
And I'll jump on that too. Mark Vince has talked to me about this. So the way I've solved this problem in the past is I'll assign a user to people who are only going to be watching a queue list. So if you're in a situation with multiple stage managers or fall spot callers or whatever, I would give them all the same user. And then my programmer, and Nick kind of touched on this earlier, my board op will have a macro that fires to that user that sends a snapshot to reset them in case they get off. And I've had good success with that. So, and I'll reply to you with my email address if you have further questions on that too.
Yeah, there's not a lot of mystery in our email schema. It's rob.crane@edtconnect.com, right?
Don't give it away. Don't.
No. What else?
Well, Matthew Minkwitz asks, can you use a primary backup with hardline DMX with a DMX merger instead of a gateway?
Yeah, you can. I don't know why you wouldn't just use a gateway. It's the same amount of hardware, and the DMX merger, the backup isn't going to be outputting DMX until it becomes the master. So you might see a drop in data, whereas a gateway can have things like hold last looks. So I think a gateway is still a better choice. Technically, it's possible. It feels a little archaic, and especially once you get above multiple universes, now you're talking how many of these things do you need to merge your data? So reasons. That's fair, as long as you know the difficulty. Cool. What else, Sam?
The last question we have is from Robert. What about setting up multiple switches for redundancy? So I think that this kind of goes back to actually something from the networking class.
Sure.
Because I know there's a specific way to set it up where you don't burn switches, but like to protect the communication if a cable is cut.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'll get on my soapbox a little bit, but yes. So switches have these features like spanning tree to be able to, you can do a ring topology where the switches aren't connected through this link. They turn those off, and then they have connection through this ring. And if they see that this ring is broken, they'll heal this connection and go back that way. So that's one way to do it. A lot of switches can do the same thing on like parallel lines that are running. I've seen a few productions do that where you can set stuff on different subnets, however your network is configured. But the difficulty with that usually is like, okay, if I'm at a festival and I'm at my mix position, and then I've got 1 million people in a pit, and then I've got my stage, and I'm running that line. If I'm worried about that line being damaged, if I run another line directly next to it, have I actually gained anything? So the answer is really that unless you're planning on routing your physical cables in different paths, the idea that having one extra pair run next to it isn't really useful. Same as if it's in a wall, right? Like if you're running in a theater from a booth to backstage, having a dry line that's there to physically patch is not a bad thing, but the likelihood that somebody's going to take like a circ saw through your conduit is really pretty low, right? So I would say be thoughtful about what a backup like that would actually get you. But there are switches and ways that you can configure your network that are more on the prosumer and kind of lower professional side that are pretty affordable. And then there are $30,000, server side banking switches, right? So like, how much failure are you willing to accept? In my life, that's a lot. Like, based on your budget and the realisticness of what's going to fail. What's more likely to happen is that a physical piece of hardware on a switch is going to fail. So either an individual port, or if you're using like a fiber sled, like an SFP or something, something like that would have a physical issue, or the power supply that feeds a switch is going to have an issue, right? So make decisions like using UPSs and power conditioners for your switchgear. Make sure you have spares on the switch or an SFP so you can physically make a switch. I think in at least theatrical production, those things are much more viable in a cost to risk comparison. If you're out on tour or out doing the festival season, where you're out in the elements, there are different things, and you need to think about them differently based on your risks. For like festival type stuff, that's why I like putting my primary on stage, right? The idea that if something gets severed between the stage and front of house, worst case, I can run backstage and keep running the show. So think about that stuff, where is it likely to fail and how much am I willing to do to overcome that percentage? So, but yeah, it's possible.
That is what we got.
Very good. Well, thank you all. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to be in touch. We have recorded this, so tell your friends if they missed it, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Take care, everybody. Be well.